As the modern world begins to return to some degree of normality, we travel back to the front. We return to that old front line in the company of a group of passengers from a Leisure Holidays battlefield tour as they walk the ground in Flanders close to the city of Ypres. After all those long months, I finally made it back to the old front line. This 18 months has been difficult for us all in so many different ways, and I have been over during that period. I managed to get to Ypres in between lockdowns last summer, but that in itself was 15 months ago, a long time to be separated from these battlefields that have been part of my life for most of my life. So what was it like to return? Many of you have no doubt thought about this. There was a degree of complexity with forms and tests and requirements, and most of France and Belgium have strict regulations with the wearing of masks and the way you check yourself into locations. But all of this just seems acceptable for the chance to be back there. A minor inconvenience, really, to be on that ground, to be in the cemeteries, to be on the Western Front. And I would encourage any of you listening to this to begin to return. The areas themselves need the battlefield pilgrims who visit every year. So much good work is done by so many people involved in the commercial side of battlefield tourism. And while there are many that perhaps feel a degree of reluctance in connecting commercialism to the subject of remembrance and the Great War, what it has helped with over the years, particularly in recent years when the Great War has been very much on people's radar and the visitor numbers have increased, it stops locations from slipping into obscurity. It's aided in the preservation of locations and places on the battlefields. And our support for that by visiting and eating in places and going to museums and sleeping in hotels and all of that really does help and will help in the rebuilding of these places, of these locations along the Western Front as we emerge from these recent dark times. But it's much more than that. For me, to be back there again, to be walking in the cemeteries, to be standing underneath the Menin Gate, to see the work being done on the Thiepval Memorial by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, to meet friends, to see old faces and meet some new ones too with the group that I had. This was all part of what I've done for so many years, and it was great to be back there doing that. Autumn on the Western Front is one of my favourite periods of the year. The change in the colour, the incredible autumn colours that you see in the cemeteries and in the woods and in the fields, the change in the wildlife and the light, the incredible autumn light across those fields and on the faces of the monuments, and as it touches the names on the headstones, it somehow adds even greater depth to those moments when you pause and you think. It felt, as I walked that ground and travelled around it in our coach, that both nothing had changed and everything had changed. It was like seeing it all again for the first time with fresh eyes. There were new developments, wind farms on the Somme. The roadworks around Ypres that had been going on for many years were finally complete, and you could drive down the Messines Ridge once more. And in the museums there were new exhibits, new displays. At Lens 1418 near Arras, I finally got to see the really superb display of battlefield photography that is there. So there were all of these different aspects, but at the heart of it was that connection, that ability to be back there. From afar, as we've done with the podcast, we can explore these places virtually, but to stand on that ground once more and look across those fields, to see the ground before Tyne Cot stretching back into Ypres, or the valley before High Wood, or the view from the crest of Hill 145 at Vimy Ridge. All of this, it's often, even for me, so difficult to put it into words. It's a feeling, a depth of feeling that you only really get when you're standing there, when you're walking that ground, and when you feel the presence that you do in the silent cities, the cemeteries of the Great War. But this was a trip where I was working. I was guiding a group from Ledger Holidays, a Ledger Holidays battlefield tour. And if this first episode that I've made, taken from recordings that I took last week, if it feels a little bit disjointed, then that's the nature of what it's like to be a guide working with a group. They're there for the first time. A few of them had been before, but most this was their first visit. And they want to get as much from that as possible. And as a battlefield guide, that's what you're there to do. And one of the recordings that I've put in here is me talking to them at Langemark German Cemetery to give you an idea of what a typical guide may do with a group when on the ground. I can't speak for every guide. Every guide has their own approach, and I wouldn't say that one is any better than others. But it just gives you a bit of an insight into the sort of things that we do. And it's not a one-way street, far from it, because people feed back things to you. They recount episodes from their own life, their own experience, and they ask you questions based on that. And it often leads you down different routes that you perhaps not considered before, and interesting asides that can perhaps add even more to the visit that you're making. And that is one of the greatly enjoyable parts of the job as a guide, in how you interact and react with the group that you've got. So this is a different sort of podcast to the one we would normally do, and there will be a second one of these from the recordings made around Arras, Luz and the Somme. But this first one is in Flanders, and recording in the open, there are the usual problems with that, with sound, and the sound at the Menin Gate, particularly with me talking, wasn't as good as I wanted, but the recording of the last posts worked very well. In moving away from the studio and out into the ground on the battlefields, there will be lessons to be learned with the podcast, and it will develop. And I look forward to going back there again, armed with a recorder, to make some more recordings on the ground, to capture something, a depth of something that it's not possible to do just by sitting here in front of my computer. As I was out there this week, my mind flashed back across the episodes that I've recorded over the last year and a half, and the veterans and the subjects and the many things that we've discussed here. It all came back, and the memories of being there with the veterans and the memories of interviewing the veterans and connecting that to the ground as I saw it, as I travelled around in those autumn days this week, it made it, I'm only happy to admit, a very emotional few days on the ground. These places, if we let them move us, they inspire us. They make us step forward into the light in many ways and think in our own lives what could be better. Does the thought of those legions of men who had such short lives themselves make us wish that in our own life we fulfill something that they couldn't, that we make the best of our lives? Yeah, we have these deep thoughts when we're there. I know many of you will have had the same. But there's a simple level to it as well. We think of the photographs and the film, the documents and the casualty lists and the war memorials back home, and the men and the women so affected by this war whose lives were never the same because of it. And we pause in simple remembrance of all of that. It's not complex. We stand at the splash of some white stone and we touch it with our hand and we remember. We think back to all that happened along that old front line. It's a beautiful autumn morning here at Tyne Cot, and it feels good to begin this return to the old front line, having travelled back to the front here at Tyne Cot, because when I last came 15 months ago, I recorded an episode of the podcast here, which you can go back to and listen to in the back catalogue of what we've got. And there's a nice kind of symmetry, really, having begun my return trip this week here with my Ledger Holidays group. We've travelled across yesterday, got through all the myriad of paperwork and everything that's needed to get across here, and we're staying just outside Lille, and we've travelled up this morning in that wonderful autumn light. And I'm looking at across the cemetery, standing by the wall of the Tyne Cot Memorial, close to the names of men from the Hampshire Regiment and the Royal Sussex Regiment, the old county of Sussex, and I look on there and see some of the names of men who I have medals to that I've picked up in junk shops over the years, and men whose stories I've uncovered. I'm looking at the name of Lieutenant Colonel H.T.K. Robinson, DSO, and he was a commanding officer of the 13th Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment. He was killed in the Battle of the Lys in April 1918, but he was there at Richbourg and saw Nelson Victor Carter win the Victoria Cross there in 1916. His story runs through the whole South Downs Battalion's history, really, in many, many ways. He died close to the Bluff, and his body was never recovered. And like so many men of the regiment, so many, many men of Britain and the Commonwealth is commemorated here on this memorial to the missing. The group that I'm with, one of the first things that they remarked upon was the large number of unidentified soldiers buried in this cemetery. You can't help but notice as you walk along the rows of graves here at Tyne Cot and you see unknown soldier after unknown soldier. In some cases a regiment is identified, in some cases a rank, in some cases a nationality, South African as opposed to Australian, as opposed to Canadian, as opposed to British, as opposed to whatever. But the exact identity of that soldier is not known. This vast legion of the missing that is so much a part of the story of the Great War. And it feels, after all these months, quite incredible to be here. In the background there's a group of local school kids on a visit to the cemetery, understanding, I suppose, as to why these things are on their landscape. And I don't know whether we're the first British tour group to come back here to Tyne Cot, but it seemed quite a moment, certainly in my life, to return here like this, significantly return here and feel as if things have returned to some degree to normality. And the acts of remembrance that we do, both small and big, in places like this can recommence once more. And these places will not feel so far away, I hope. There's young people all around me in the cemetery now. Good morning. And I'm standing under one of the trees close to the Cross of Sacrifice. It's autumn and of course the leaves are falling, and it brings to mind that phrase, home before the leaves fall. It's always, for me anyway, an evocative time of year coming to the battlefields in October and November. The season's changing, the colours are changing, the landscape changes. And I'm looking out across the battlefields around Ypres now, towards the wind farm near Bozinga, where the Third Battle of Ypres, the Battle of Passchendaele, began on the 31st of July. Passchendaele's now behind me. And that ground, that tiny strip of ground in between those two places, with so much sacrifice, so much loss in 1917, and a landscape then quite unimaginable compared to what it is today. That moonscape of shell craters and the mud, the glutinous mud into which everything disappeared one way and another. But I can see the spires of Ypres too. And the cloth hall, the main building in Ypres, which in medieval times was the centre of the European cloth trade, is covered in scaffolding, and I can just see some of the white sheeting around it. No doubt I'll see that closer up when I'm in Ypres later today. But again, I can't easily express how good it is to be back here. It has felt so far away, and has been good to rekindle what it all means through talking to you all through this podcast, but to be back here, and I hope many of you get a chance to get back here again soon. Good morning.
Yes. Nee, wat doe je in de speaker?
Ja, podcast.
Wat heet dat? Wat kom je van Engeland?
Ja, Engels.
Mijn papa komt daar ook.
podcast.
Podcast. Wat is dat? Dat is wel like zo een...
Hij kan Engels.
Die kan spreken.
Ja.
Dat is ook...
Dank u wel. The young people of Flanders, inquisitive while I'm walking around with a microphone. Probably no more than 12 or 13. They'll live their whole life with this on their landscape. I've come to a quiet corner of Tyncott now, and of course in these last 18 months British school groups haven't come here, but it looks as if quite a significant number of local Flemish schools have. There's quite a lot of tributes on the graves placed by local school children where they've drawn their own interpretation of the war and left their own message. It's really quite touching to see this. I'll put a picture on the podcast website so you can see what I'm talking about here, and it's really quite wonderful to think that a new generation of people who will have to make sense of all this and make sense of perhaps conflict in their own lifetime have come here to see this. And there's no doubt that the experience of travelling to these battlefields changes people, whether young or old, completely changes how they view things. There's a gentle breeze across the cemetery, no chiff-chaffs, but a few pigeons flying over. I've seen some magpies in the field close by. The world seems for now here content. The season's moved on. Winter approaches, but for now there's colour in Tyncott. And here, once more, we reconnect with the Great War. I think this podcast will probably be a podcast of fragments of thoughts, of musings on what it feels like to be back here again, and hopefully the odd chat with some people along the way. But start here in this great bastion of the dead on a hillside in Flanders, overlooking so many of those fields connected with the story of the Great War. Our journey continues. Morning. Okay, well this is Langemark German cemetery, Langemark Deutsche Soldatenfriedhof in German. It's a wartime cemetery that was made in 1915. The main plot, forget this bit for the minute, the main plot around us here, up to where we can see the bunkers and the line of blocks there, is all part of the original cemetery. And this was made after that Second Battle of Ypres period, when the Germans had pushed forward. One of the first releases of poison gas by the Germans was just on the other side of where the cemetery is now located. There was a marker there pre-COVID days. I'm not sure if it's still there now. We'll go and have a look. But so it was a wartime cemetery made what was then behind the German lines, so safe enough away from the battlefield to bury your dead, because the front lines were in that direction, just over there. And then it was expanded upon gradually. Now, after the war, it was one of many German cemeteries that existed on the landscape. This had seen fighting again in 1917. So when we look at the three bunkers that are there, they're very neat and tidy because they were refaced when this cemetery was made permanent. But underneath them are real, original German concrete bunkers from the defensive line that was there during the Third Battle of Ypres. So this was smashed to bits by shell fire, basically, in 1917, very badly damaged. But there was enough of it left to reconstitute the cemetery after the war. Now, many people believe that the Germans were not given the proper chance to bury the dead. There is a book worth of myths about this cemetery, really. But the Germans were, and there was also a belief during the war that the Germans didn't actually bury their dead. There was British propaganda that accused the Germans of melting down their dead to make glycerine for high explosive shells. At German military funerals, they don't play the last post. They sing a song called Ich hatte einen Kameraden, I had a comrade. And there was a wartime propaganda cartoon that was called I Had a Comrade, and it shows a fat German soldier pouring a liquid out of a glass vessel into the top of a shell. And when you look at the liquid, it's full of the horrified faces of his comrades who he's melted down, dead comrades, to pour into that shell. Now that is a piece of wartime propaganda. That's not the reality of it. In some respects, if you look at 19th century social history and the influence that Germany had on Britain through our monarchy and the close contact between these countries, a lot of the whole Victorian approach to the commemoration of the dead comes from Germany. So it's not a surprise that German cemeteries during the war were often a lot more ornate and intricate than British cemeteries were behind our area of the battlefields. So German cemeteries existed, and this one was made permanent. However, of course, some years later, another character came along called Adolf Hitler. And Hitler had fought in the Great War. He wasn't in this battle, although here at Langemark in 1914, although he claimed to be, because this, for Germany, was an epic moment in the Great War when the so-called Studentensoldaten, student soldiers, went into battle. Now, I mentioned to you how the German army was a conscript army. It didn't need wartime volunteers. And one of the exceptions to that were the student soldiers who enlisted from colleges and schools and universities, very close to the lowest age bracket to be able to serve in the military. But because they were at educational institutions that had their own training units, military training units, they did know how to march, they did know how to shoulder a rifle, they knew which end of it was dangerous, and they were sent straight into battle here in 1914. And one of these myths, one of the earliest myths about Langemark, is that these men went into action, the prime of Germany's youth, arm in arm, marching into battle, singing Deutschland über alles, which actually wasn't even the national anthem for Germany at that time. And they walked straight into the firepower of British regular soldiers who inflicted heavy losses. And Hitler and the Nazis used that story, twisted it, and used it as an example of how the state had betrayed the nation in the war by sending the prime of Germany, the best of its youth, the best of its Aryan youth, to a pointless death on the battlefield. And Hitler wanted to be associated with this battle, so claimed that he fought here when he didn't. He was in reserve. He did fight at Ypres in 1914, just down the road at Gellerveld, close to where we came off the motorway this morning. But in the 30s, essentially, this cemetery was Nazified. The influence of the emerging Third Reich regime was very much implanted on this cemetery. And if you look at it now, you can see echoes of it still. They've changed it over the years. They've tried to remove some of that. When you used to come in through the entrance as we did, the first thing you would see was a plaque on the wall that read, Deutschland muss leben und wenn wir sterben müssen. Germany must live even if we must die. And it was one of Hitler's favourite sayings, partly because he didn't have to do the dying bit. But things like that were introduced, and when that murderous regime went to war in 1939 and overrun Western Europe, Hitler decided to go on a battlefield tour, not organised by Leisure Holidays, I hasten to add. He did it under his own steam, and he got a staff car and some of his old mates from his Bavarian infantry regiment, and they came and visited the places where they fought. And they came here to Langemark, and he walked straight through the front entrance like we just did. You saw the big wrought iron gates. He was photographed standing in front of those, and then he went up to the bunkers up here, because when this cemetery was made permanent in the 1930s, they created what was called a Heldenfeld, a heroes field. And this is the heroes field. This is where the dead are buried. The blocks are not anti-tank blocks, which some guidebooks claim that they are. They were put there for two reasons. That regimental organisations could add memorials to them, and also they mark symbolically the front line in Flanders during the Great War. And the three bunkers symbolise the three main towns where the German army fought in Flanders. Newport on the coast, Dixmude further down, and Ypres, or Ypres as they called it. So that was a symbolism of the front line that these men had once held. And beyond that, in the 30s, 20s and 30s, just beyond those blocks was a wild field full of wild flowers, poppies and blue cornflowers and things like that. And that was called Nieman's Land, no man's land, and that was symbolic of the ground between the two sets of trenches. And beyond that, which you'll see when we walk out, was a moat which was to symbolise the Channel coast. So the whole thing was about symbolism. If you know anything about the Third Reich, you'll know that everything they ever built and constructed was full of symbolism, dark symbolism, but in this case that's what this represented. So the Volksbund was now responsible for every German cemetery everywhere in the world from both world wars. And it looked at the situation in places like Flanders, and there were too many cemeteries. So they closed the majority of them and they moved them into several main sites, into Kameradengraben, comrades' graves or mass graves. And that's what we've got here. In that plot, there are over 20,000 German soldiers buried in there. And again, this is where one of the myths develops, is that people think that that is some kind of hell pit that the Germans just tossed people in after the war. What's under here? This is just a roof with an earth plantation on it to grow. I mean, they've had various things grown in there over the years. Underneath is a massive vault. And in that vault, there are boxes full of the bones of the soldiers who were moved from cemeteries. So when we see these plaques here, these are all the different states and departments of Belgium. They, at first thought, look like battle honours of the German army in the Great War, and they are in some ways, but they're also the places where their cemeteries were located. And this is where they were moved from to be reburied in here. So you could have, and I'll give you a mythical example, you could have a German woman whose father was killed at Mons in 1914, and he was buried in Mons Communal Cemetery opposite the British plot that's in there. And when Hitler came to power, ironically, Germans began to travel around Europe again in a way that they hadn't done since 1914, for different reasons, of course. And a lot of Germans came to these battlefields to visit the cemetery. So she could have gone to see her dad's grave at Mons and seen this elaborate grave, individually marked grave, and been very happy that her father was properly commemorated. The Second World War comes along, she goes who knows where, she somehow survives, and then in the 50s or 60s, she's now an old lady, she thinks, I'm going to come back and I'm going to see my dad's grave one last time. And she goes to Mons and the grave is gone. It's gone. And she discovers that he's in here. So now she comes here and all she sees is this with these Emil Krieger statues, and they depict German soldiers at a burial with their Stahlhelms, their steel helmets on their chest, singing I Had a Comrade. That's what that depicts. And there's nothing, there's no father's name isn't even mentioned here, because these plaques that do mention the ones that are known to be buried in here were only erected in 1983.
Gosh.
So there was nothing to say who was actually buried in here. So in the 50s this was done, and all of the individual grave markers that were in here were removed, and these plaques were put in which list multiple names. And again, another myth is that modern visitors come here, see 5 or 10 names on one of them things and think they're all buried in the same grave, but actually they're buried individually in a row. They just remove the individual marker because that was too expensive to maintain, and put a communal one for that entire bit of the row. So we're seeing a compromise that the Germans did after the war because of the circumstances which the Volksbund found itself, now being in a nation with Germany carved in half and not enough money to commemorate these sites. Marching on a bit, Germany's a pretty rich nation these days, but I don't see any will in Germany to come back and try and redress any of this. To them, we look at this as a dark, foreboding place with these dark trees, but these are oak trees, and in the German sense of what these men were, they were not Soldaten, they were not soldiers, they were Krieger, which is a warrior. And this is the tree that you plant on a warrior's grave, and that's why they're in here. But of course they create this canopy that makes this a dark cemetery for most of the year. And to us it's very different in its approach and style to what we see. But I would guess even just us coming here now is more than the number of Germans that have been here this year. Germans don't come to these places in any significant numbers because Germany was split for so many years. Those that were in the former East Germany have no sense of this war at all. But it is a place where the echoes and the crisscross of both world wars really comes through this like a dark thread in Langemarck, because it's intertwined not only with the history of what happened here in the Great War, but in the post-war emergence of nationalistic fervour and extreme politics, and Adolf and all his mates. It's all tied into this. It's been a busy day so far. It often is on battlefield tours. I'm sure some people think that the life of a guide is an easy one and all you're doing is coming on holiday, but it's not really like that. you've got a group of people that are fascinated to learn and are fascinated by the subject that you've come to discuss on a tour like this, and they want to know as much as possible, and that's part of your job, is to tell them these things outside the talks you give them at different locations. They come up and ask questions, and that's really, really good. And we say that there's no such thing as a stupid question on these kind of tours, and that's exactly right, because these people are starting from the most basic level of knowledge on this, and they want to understand what these trenches were about and what the life in the line was like and what the soldiers thought and what they drank and what they ate. And several people have asked about where did they go to the toilet, things like that. So all of these questions come up, and it's really great to be back here and doing this kind of thing again. And I'm at the moment in Sanctuary Wood, at the Sanctuary Wood Trench Museum. And some people might listen to this and groan and think, oh, why is he taking them there? Well, it's a really important place to come to, because if you go back in our back catalogue of podcasts again, you'll see that there's one on Sanctuary Wood where I try to dispel the myth that these are somehow fake trenches. They're not, and I'm walking towards them now across this bit of ground in the wood. It's autumn, and the trees are, as we've said before, shedding their leaves, and there's horse chestnuts come down in the wood here. I can hear the branches breaking under my feet as I walk through here, and I'm coming up to the beginning of the trenches that are here. And it's been wet the last few days in this part of Flanders, and the trench is muddy and wet and dank and pretty horrible to have a look into, which is only really a tiny glimpse into what it must have been like at different points during the war. The soldiers didn't live in abject misery all the time, and part of their work in trenches like this was to continually repair them. I'm just walking now into the entrance bit with the iron tin on the side of it, supporting the side of the trench, and there's some curved bits. The sound should change a little bit as I walk through here, because I'm in a covered part of the trench now, and I'm coming up to the first traverse, which is the turn of the trench that gives it the zigzag shape. And when you look at LiDAR of this, modern LiDAR, and the trench maps, you'll see that these trenches are 100% original. They may have been repaired, they may have been worked on and propped up and all that kind of stuff, but these are original, and they give us this insight into what trenches were like. Not the ultimate insight, but a partial insight, and it's really important to come here and see these. And I'm walking my way down through this next bit of the trench, looking at the back, the Parados, out across to the edge of the wood towards Zillebeek, and that's where the reserve line was. The trench that I'm in here is not a front line trench, it's a support line trench. The actual front line was up on the hill on Sanctuary Wood. So this was part of the infrastructure of the battlefield, the front line, the support line, higher. Part of my group just coming round, and then the reserve line behind. And when soldiers were in the line in places like this, they would rotate between those positions, so that soldiers as individuals never spent a massive amount of time in the very front line itself. And one of the things I think, I'm walking through this section now, the trenches are narrow, and these aren't artificially narrow here, they are narrow. It was a tiny confined world, the trench world, for the soldiers on the Western Front. And again, coming to places like this is why it's so important to come and see these sites and compare the different ways and places in where trenches have been preserved or reconstructed using experimental archaeology, to get a sense of what this world where these men lived was once like. And even though it's mucky and wet and damp, there's a lot that's still missing. The smell of the battlefield, the sound of the battlefield. There's no sandbags on the parapet and no sandbags on the Parados. The duck boards are not in here, but still I would always say to people, if you're going to come to Flanders for the first time, make your way to Sanctuary Wood. It's a really interesting, important, quite moving place to come to amongst the trees. The wind's whistling through the leaves now. In the spring, these trees are full of birdsong. And the soldiers who were here during the war would have heard the same. So it's that kind of connection to the landscape that you get as well by coming to places like this. But when I come here to Sanctuary Wood and I stand in these trenches, I think back to some of the early trips that I made here with my old pals from school, like Andrew Whittington and Steve Chambers. And I think what a thrill it was for us to visualise trenches like this by coming to Sanctuary Wood, and how I think that is still important for modern visitors, whether young or indeed old. And I'm looking at my group now, wandering around and being equally as fascinated by this trench system as we were nearly 40 years ago. But I also think of the vets that I knew standing in trenches like this, living in trenches like this, seeing their mates die in trenches like this, and the stories that they told, and the smells that would often transport them back to places like this. The smell of bacon and the smell of quicklime that was often put in shell holes where they were dead, or on the battlefield in front if there'd been an attack and bodies were lying out there. But also occasionally, it wasn't all doom and gloom, that they would pause. And we mentioned how in the spring these trees here are full of birdsong, and they were men who lived in the natural world before the war and still connected to it even in places like this. So there's a nice resonance of that, really. And I've just been talking to some members of the group about this, about what it feels like to come to trenches like this for the first time, and they're quite decrepit, really, and the decrepit nature of the way they're preserved perhaps adds another level to it. The trenches didn't look like this during the war. There's so many things that we've said that are missing, sandbags and so on, but nevertheless these will leave an impression on you, and I think that having that impression, capturing the imagination by seeing this and imagining men living their lives and ending their lives in places like this, spurs us on to want to find more. So, as well as the sad parts of the past that we find amongst the trees of Sanctuary Wood, perhaps we also find a glimmer of hope, of understanding and of kinship, connection to those ordinary men who were here during those extraordinary times of the Great War. The day has come to an end, and we're here in Ypres, and I'm stood on this autumn evening. You can hear the voices perhaps in the background of Belgian school children who've been looking around the battlefields today. There are some members of the Netherlands Army here, and I'm standing on the battlefield side of the Menin Gate, looking up at the columns lit by the lamps here. You can see the battle scars of May 1940, when the bridge, the moat bridge that I'm standing on, was blown by an officer of the Royal Engineers, stopped the Germans from getting into the city, and the front face of the gate was impacted by shrapnel, and the pock marks of the shrapnel and the bricks still are there. Some pieces were patched up, and when the light is like this on the gate, you can see it very, very clearly here. So it's how those two major events of the first half of the 20th century come together here. And I'm looking into the names. Sassoon called this a sepulchre of crime, the Menin Gate, because of this legion of missing soldiers whose names are recorded on its walls. But that was Sassoon, not me. And I see this as a place to come and reflect. There's a group of Netherlands soldiers just marching up into the gate now, just like soldiers marched through here in the Great War. And these men parade here from an army that didn't participate in this war, but men from the Netherlands did fight here. They served in Canadian regiments and Australian regiments, and even one or two in British regiments. And soldiers have a respect for those soldiers of the past, and that's why I guess these men are here. And it's a good thing to see. That damage from the Second World War marked a dark period in the history of the Menin Gate. 4 years of occupation. 4 long years. Until Ypres was liberated by Maciek's Poles. And Polish soldiers stood where these soldiers from the Netherlands stand now, on the 6th of September 1944, as Belgium was liberated. And the bugles that had been hidden for those 4 years came out of hiding, and the last post was played, and has been played every evening ever since, just as it will tonight. Just as it will tonight. I've lost count of the times that I've heard the last post at the Meningate. It must run into its hundreds and hundreds, but the feeling each time is the same. It's not that it diminishes somehow, it grows stronger the more that I hear it, and particularly after this gap of those 18 months. So much time to reflect on its meaning, of hearing those intense notes as they die away to a silence, and you're surrounded under that archway by the ghosts of the past, but not just the ghosts. That evening in Ypres, as I recorded this, most of the people there were from the Netherlands or from Flanders, and in these 18 months it is they who have held the torch for us, a fact worthy of remembrance, I think. They kept it going so that we might return, that we might come back and walk once more along the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcore. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.